Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
I'm Justin Tewald. For our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. Okay, so we're chatting in early November 2025. As usual, this will go into a long queue of recorded podcast episodes that are in editing and awaiting release. It'll be a while before it comes out, but we're midway through the fall semester and curious what you've been up to at this point in the semester, Richard. I take it you've been teaching?
Yep. And I've also given a few talks. One of the most recent ones was at the University of Scranton, which is a college in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And it's, of course, very famous for a certain TV show. And which,
yes.
Yeah, you might know of, Justin.
I know it. The Office, right? That's the one that takes place in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's become sort of an iconic show. Many of our listeners will at least have heard of it, and many of them will know it very well. Yeah, so I think it was the mid-2000s or late 2000s that I watched a couple years of it with my partner. We eventually gave up, but I know it. I think it's been popular in the West, especially in the United States and North America, because of its archetypes. I mean, all the characters in the show represent a type of white-collar office colleague that everyone is at least somewhat familiar with, you know? They're kind of the prototypical, like the boss, Michael Scott is his name, right? He's seemingly well-intentioned, but he's so unself-aware, right? He's like, doesn't even realize how silly he looks, how obvious, how transparent some of his schemes are to the other workers.
I must say, I watched it in part because all of my graduate student friends in philosophy during those years, we're talking about 2006, 2007, and so on, they just loved that show. And they would refer to it all the time. Yeah. And I think I watched a few episodes just so I can be in the conversation.
Yes.
And I do remember thinking, wow, it's very clever, nicely done, but it didn't quite resonate with me. I mean, I could see why they found it funny, and I found the show funny. It's a kind of a dry humor, right? And you're right, that boss is kind of clueless and he could be wildly offensive. I don't know if that could be shown nowadays, or some people may be too offended by some of the stuff he says. But and these outrageous characters like Dwight Schrute, played by this actor named Rainn Wilson. And there were these other memorable characters too, I remember. There was like a kind of a romantic relationship with Jim and Pam. That's right, yeah. So maybe that's a natural part of the office environment. I don't even know. I guess I've never been in that kind of environment, so maybe that's partly why I wasn't able to connect that well.
Yeah, it might be that it's more kind of a middle America thing. I grew up in Nebraska, and I just had summer jobs occasionally in offices like that. But somehow the character types are so representative of a broad swath of work personalities. Yeah, there's the office romance. I mean, the relationships sort of occupy this nebulous in-between state between being friendships and mere collegial work relationships. And that's why the office romance is such an object of fascination, or at least it was back then, I think, is that there was even this kind of running joke that people could be work husbands or work wives. There'd be people who, outside of the work context, would not even be romantically attached to each other. It's understood it's just a work thing where they kind of look out for each other. Anyway, it's a kind of psychological, sociological study. I think a lot of people found it very eye-opening and entertaining. And that might explain why some of your colleagues in graduate school, many of whom grew up in North America, found it relatable.
Well, there you go, Justin. I think you actually know probably more about that show than I do. But I guess we should maybe go on to today's topic and introduce it. And so today's topic is about moral autonomy and moral deference. But actually, those terms might be slightly unclear to some listeners. And we actually have something more specific in mind.
Yes.
And so this is a topic that you've really been interested in for many years now, I think. And you've published a recent short piece for the general public, and I'm sure we'll put that in the show notes later. But the specific question is something like the following. In deciding what ethical beliefs we should live by, when should we act on our best judgment, and when should we defer to other authorities that we take to be more knowledgeable? Would you say that's a fair characterization, Justin?
Yeah, that's a good characterization. I think it's a super familiar sort of problem. And once I give some examples, people will know what I'm talking about. So let's just imagine that I'm going to a funeral. We'll say it's my grandfather's funeral. And I'm tempted to wear a T-shirt featuring my favorite rock band. And I don't know why. Maybe I think my grandfather would have appreciated it or something. But in any case, my aunt, who's more knowledgeable, more experienced, intervenes and says, this doesn't work. This is not appropriate clothing for a funeral. Not a good way to mourn your grandfather. And I'd say I think that she's far more likely to be right than I am, based on my own best judgment. So I adopt her view that I shouldn't wear this rock band t-shirt on her authority, right? That's a case of moral deference. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. So what do we contrast it with? I mean, in Chinese, fortunately, we have this nice term, 自得, which translates as getting it oneself. In English, we don't really have a term of art to describe what is the opposite of moral deference. So I guess that's why we're going to say autonomy. Cases where you're basically making your own moral or ethical decision, arriving at your own actionable moral ethical beliefs on the basis of your own best judgment, tracking the reasons that make it right for yourself, as opposed to deferring to some sort of external epistemic process. Epistemic means having to do with knowledge, right? So external knowledge process or external knower. In those cases, I'm deferring and not getting it for myself. But I think the short version of today's topic is basically this. How did the historical Confucian philosophers actually position themselves on cases like this? Cases where it might be tempting to look for someone who is more likely to arrive at the correct ethical belief than you and defer to them. So I think a lot of people, if they have a kind of stereotypical understanding of Confucianism, they might think that Confucianism is strongly pro-deference. You know, there's a kind of stereotype about Confucianism that I think basically describes Confucianism as a cultural phenomenon, not necessarily Confucianism as a philosophy, which says that it's all about deferring to authorities, right? So it's, Confucianism as a tradition where you can defer to the tradition or to the teachers or to the elders or the books, the canonical books that every Confucian is supposed to read. That's one way of understanding the Confucian tradition, and it might be tempting to say the whole Confucian tradition is essentially on board with deference. But actually, historically speaking, it's way more interesting, way more diverse and nuanced. So basically, here's the short version of the history of moral deference and moral autonomy in the Confucian tradition. There was a very strong proponent of moral deference, and that's Xunzi, Xunzi. And he was not only a strong proponent of moral deference in the sense that he gave strong arguments for it, but also that he thought basically in almost all areas of life, almost all people should be deferring to the tradition and its authoritative interpreters. So he advocated for a strong form of moral deference, kind of pervasive deference in all different ethical domains. And he indeed was influential. A lot of Confucian philosophers were influenced by Xunzi. But actually, in the longer run, if we take the full 2.5 millennia of Confucian philosophy into account, his influence waned. It subsided. And by the time we get to the 11th century or so, most Confucians think that Xunzi was essentially a kind of heterodox thinker, or at least a marginal Confucian thinker. And one of the reasons, I'd argue one of the main reasons that they disagreed with him was because of his views about moral deference. So in fact, most of the influential Confucians in the later tradition were pro-autonomy. And that's one of the reasons they rejected Xunzi. To make a long story short, the history of this issue in Confucian philosophy is fascinating because I think we have Xunzi, history's strongest advocate for a strong form of moral deference. And yet, at the same time, we have this reaction to Xunzi, where we have philosophers articulating in a very sophisticated way the case for moderate autonomy and in some cases even radical autonomy. That's what we're going to do for today.
All right. This is, I think, a great topic. I have a lot of questions here, but I'm going to hold off. We'll begin our discussion of moral autonomy and moral deference after the interlude. All right, so we are back, and today's topic, to remind the listeners, is moral autonomy and moral deference in Confucian philosophy. Now, as usual, we have a few passages we'd like to focus on, and we've picked 2 passages from the Xunzi, someone who defended deference very strongly in pretty much all areas of moral life.
Yeah.
But before we start reading Xunzi's argument for strong moral deference, I think it'd be good to give listeners a sense of the big picture across history. So how influential was Xunzi's case for strong moral deference? Over the next 2 millennia, there were many other Confucian philosophers. What did they think?
Okay, yeah. Thanks for giving me that opportunity, Richard. Yeah, I want to emphasize this is an interesting issue for the Confucian tradition because it is, in some sense, the focal point. It's the kind of the philosophical engine that generates so much controversy over the roughly 2,500 years of pre-modern Confucian philosophy. So it's not that everyone's on board with deference. In fact, it's precisely this issue of deference that we can use to distinguish between different schools of thought, different lineages. That's one of the reasons I get excited, probably too excited about this issue. So yeah, it's not the case that everyone's on board with strong moral deference. Xunzi, I think, stands as world history's most articulate defender of the strongest case for moral deference. So we'll discuss that argument and also what moral deference looks like for him shortly. But actually, Xunzi was ultimately seen as a kind of outlier to the mainstream tradition. So by the 11th century, I would say most Confucian philosophers saw him as mistaken. And in fact, the consensus that he was mistaken was so widespread that they don't always bother to articulate what it is that they find objectionable about Xunzi's view. But I think that one of the things they find most objectionable is that if you sign on to Xunzi's views about human nature and the foundations of ethics, you will not be able to get the whole project of acquiring moral understanding and thus virtue off the ground. So I think the shared consensus view was that Xunzi couldn't explain. He was so pro-deference in ethics and morality that he couldn't explain how people become virtuous in the first place. And that was for them a kind of counsel of despair, right? A recommendation just to be depressed and bummed out that you can never become a good person. So that was just not a viable road to take. So the stronger view among the more influential philosophers that self-identify Confucians read and study closely nowadays, most were pro-autonomy to some degree. And they were either kind of moderately pro-autonomy or more radically pro-autonomy. We will discuss what it is that makes some more moderate, some more radical, I think, when we get to the end of our discussion today. But I'll just say this much. Because they were interested in this issue, they developed a kind of term of art to characterize the opposite of deference, the opposite of cases where you have some actionable moral belief that you've adopted on the authority of the tradition or of some moral expert. And the term that they used was in Chinese, 自得 or 自得之, but it's often translated as something like get it oneself. 自得 is ambiguous. The word get in English is ambiguous. So is the word de in Chinese. So it can mean lots of things. But when it's used as an epistemic term, when it's used to describe an epistemic achievement, an achievement having to do with knowledge or understanding, get it oneself works pretty well. Yeah, so that's the long and short of it, is that Xunzi was kind of this great defender of pervasive moral deference in almost every domain of your ethical life. And then later, these Neo-Confucians came along who were critical of Xunzi, and it seems like one of the principal objections was they found his views about pervasive moral deference unpalatable. They found them hard to square with their understanding of how moral cultivation works, how people acquire virtues, and so on.
Okay, so I think we should turn to the arguments. Now, in your recently published essay, you say that there are two sorts of arguments for pervasive moral deference, both of which appeal to analogies. And one analogizes the reasons to defer to the Confucian way to the reasons to adopt well-established arts or crafts like, say, cooking or music. The other draws an analogy between deferring to the Confucian way and adopting a well-tested technology like transportation technologies or plumb lines for measuring the depth of things. Do you want to read the first one and I'll read the second?
Okay, good. So we'll do the two passages we've chosen. Each articulate a different analogy that's meant to explain or illustrate or sort of make intuitive this idea that we should defer to a time-tested tradition. And one of them compares the Confucian way, and we can think of the Confucian way as consisting of all these moral or ethical models or norms. It compares that to arts and crafts like cooking or music. And it says that just as we should adopt the methods for learning an art or craft, even if we don't understand those methods by our own lights ahead of time, so too should we adopt the Confucian way and take its recommendations for how to behave and how to improve ourselves, even if we don't understand the reasons for doing that. So yeah, here's the passage. We're using the Ercutten translation, and here it is. With regard to all people in the world, it is indeed the case that they each have their own particular ideas. Nevertheless, There are some to whom they accede in common. Those who discourse on flavor accede to Iya, who, by the way, is historically this really great cook. Those who discourse on tones, like musical tones, accede to music master Kuang, who is historically one of the great musicians. Those who discourse on order accede to the three kings. Now, the three kings, I should say, as an aside, are the founders, in some sense, for Xunzi, of the Confucian way, the founding figures. They're essentially the founders of the three classical dynasties, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties. Okay, I'll continue. Since the three kings already fixed models and measures and established rituals and music and handed them down, then if there should be some who do not use them and instead change and create these themselves, how would this be any different from changing Iya's blends of flavors and altering music master Kuang's musical scales? All right. So, imagine that you want to become a great cook or great musician. How do you go about doing that? Surely you would want to take up the recommendations and practices of these great cooks and musicians of the past. Why would you go about trying to sort of reinvent these crafts or, learn these crafts from the grounds up without taking up the recommendations of these masters, of these experts? That's Xunzi's question. So similarly, why would you want to become a better person, try to become a better person without taking up the Confucian way? So I'll read the last line. When the models of the three kings are absent, the empire will be lost even without a moment's delay, and a state will perish without even a moment's delay. So he's essentially adding that the consequences, the stakes are very high in this case. If you don't adopt the Confucian way, it could have severe consequences for social order and so on. So given that the stakes are so high, there isn't room to play around, right? You can't just sort of experiment like you could if you were cooking. I mean, if you make a bad meal, probably in most cases, it'll be all right. But if you fail to learn to observe the proper social protocols with others, that could have all kinds of deleterious effects on social order. And that's a risk we can't afford to take. Yeah, so that's the analogy. And I guess just to make it a little more explicit, we could sort of say, imagine that you're a musical novice trying to figure out how best to achieve greater proficiency or mastery in musical performance. And it seems like Xunzi is saying something like this. If you want to make progress, look around and see who the great musicians are and see what sorts of practices they recommend. For example, this music master Kuang apparently is known for tuning. I mean, it doesn't mention it in this passage, but there's another passage in the Mengzi where it says music master Kuang was particularly famous for being able to tune instruments, to recognize, when they were tuned just right. And that's because he had a good intuitive sense of the musical scales. I think it's a 12-part scale in classical music. So you should adopt the traditional musical scales that music master Kuang recommends, even if you don't quite see the point in it yourself. And you should practice your scales, right? You should also probably practice these really great pieces of music, even if you haven't yet fully appreciated the musicality of them, what makes them really wonderful. So a novice musician just needs to adopt some practices without seeing the basis or the rationale for those practices, simply because they have it on good authority that these are good practices. They have a reliable source, music master Kuang and this musical tradition, which is more likely to recommend to them good musical practices than they ever are if they're trying to figure it out on their own. I think that's how we unpack the metaphor.
Yeah, so I cook quite often, and I wasn't always someone who enjoyed cooking. But when I started, because, we have children and, you can't just eat out every day. So, yeah, I learned by watching Gordon Ramsay videos and another famous chef named Jacques Pepin. Jacques Pepin is a terrific French chef and a really, really great chef. He was good friends with Julia Childs. So nowadays you can watch these YouTube clip and you can look at the recipe and watch them. And they have these different techniques and, they talk about the different temperature at which you should cook certain kinds of foods and, how to rotate the chicken or rotate the broccoli as it cooks in the oven and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if I was to just kind of do that from scratch, it would have been pretty rough. In fact, I think I would have been ousted by my family.
You would have gotten out of cooking for many years.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I might have been out of cooking. In fact, I heard that was a strategy. One of my, I think my grandfather, he hated cooking, and some people thought that he purposefully cooked badly because then nobody would ever ask him to cook. So,
strategic incompetence, they call
it. That's right. And so there's a kind of accumulation of kind of knowledge, right? That's been gathered by all these various chefs from the past. And I'm sure Jacques Pepin learned from his teacher, whoever he learned from, and so did Gordon Ramsay. Yeah, it's so much better than starting from scratch, obviously. So yeah, this seems like a very plausible view, for Xunzi. And there's this basic idea that we're all, cultural, historical beings. We don't just sprout out of nowhere. We're part of a inherited past and a kind of tradition. And so we can't really move forward until we've sort of learned from the wisdom that's accumulated from the past. And that does seem like a very sane way of proceeding.
That's a good point, Richard. So can I just seize this opportunity to make another point about where I think the real controversy lies? Mm-hmm. So I think, and I know that you agree with me because we discussed this topic way too much before we started recording, but I think it's useful to distinguish between cases where you watch Gordon Ramsay and get his advice, and then sort of see the rationale for the advice yourself and adopt it for that reason. We'll call that the advice-giving model. And other cases where you don't actually see the rationale, but you adopt it anyway because you figure this expert must know what he or she is doing. And that's true deference, right? So when Gordon Ramsay says to you, okay, you should rotate the chicken periodically, otherwise it'll get burned or something, presumably you quickly apprehend the reason why you should rotate it, You can see why this is a good thing to do. And so in some sense, you're still maintaining your epistemic autonomy, or if that's what we want to call it. You're not deferring, right? You're still kind of retaining the right, so to speak, to decide for yourself how best to proceed in cooking your chicken. And that's different. I mean, surely everyone's on board with advice giving. Everyone thinks it's good to go to those who know more. They might be able to more efficiently help you identify what some of the relevant moral or ethical considerations are, or culinary considerations. But the hard cases are the ones where really you just don't grasp what it is that makes a particular ethical practice the right one. So going back to my example, let's just say this is a 15-year-old Justin. I don't see why anyone should care whether I wear my Rock Band t-shirt to the funeral or not. But I trust that my aunt knows better than I do what to do. And so I adopt her advice on her authority. That is true moral deference, I think. And so it would be similar to cases where you're learning how to cook and you actually don't quite understand why you have to add salt at this stage of the cooking process rather than this other stage. But you have greater confidence in Gordon Ramsay than you do yourself. So you time the adding of salt according to his recommendation,
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning stages of cooking, it operates probably a bit more like that, right? Where you're like, I'm not sure why I should put the salt later. Yeah. Sometimes it's later than before, but you just assume, okay, for whatever reason, this will make the chicken taste better and come out better in the long run. And so you just kind of do it. Here's another pop culture reference, Justin, which seems to come up. Have you ever seen the movie Karate Kid?
Yes.
Okay, so you have seen that. That's a pretty famous movie.
I'm a child of the 80s, early 90s. Yeah.
I think that might have been like 84. I was born in 83. It's right around when I was born. And there's a scene, I don't know if you remember, but I guess it's a spoiler alert. I mean, it doesn't really matter that much, I think. When Ralph Macchio's character, Daniel, so he's trying to learn karate from Mr. Miyagi, right?
Yeah.
And the beginning of how that works is he just tells him, sand the floor and, wash the car. And he makes him do it all day long, well into the night, as Mr. Miyagi's like fishing and having a nice time. And after several days of this, Daniel just gets very angry. He's like, he doesn't understand why he's doing it, right? And it just like his arm is sore. And finally, he's had enough and he's about to just go. And then there's this brilliant scene where Mr. Miyagi tells him to start doing those moves of, sanding the floor and washing the car. And then he shows him how those are the moves and the techniques he needed to practice over and over in order to then be able to carry out those karate moves, which he was able to do after all that practice. And so I was wondering about what you think of that kind of example. I think Xunzi would have liked that scene.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Oh my God, that's right. That's a good example because at first, Daniel, the main character, is skeptical. He's like, oh no, Mr. Miyagi has just basically tricked me into doing all these sort
of slave labor. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I think one of the other tasks was painting the fence, right?
Painting the fence, exactly.
Right. But it turns out, yes, that Mr. Miyagi's been teaching Daniel this muscle memory, which becomes useful for him when he has to actually defend himself or anyway, engage in actual karate. Yeah. So in that case, I mean, it's not even clear to me that Daniel in that case is accepting the belief that these are good karate practices, sanding the floor, painting the fence, and washing the car. But let's just stipulate for the sake of argument that he is. In that case, that looks more like Xunzian moral deference, I think. Yeah, you're adopting these practices, these rituals, protocols, these social protocols, these essential, kind of like rough descriptions of rules of right and wrong and that sort of thing, without being able to fully grasp, or maybe without being able to grasp at all, the considerations or the reasons that make them right. Yeah, so that is a good illustration. Yeah.
Yeah. And then over time, of course, Daniel is able to integrate those various moves. And then I think he comes to realize the rationale behind those moves and the rationale behind why he was painting the fence and washing the cars and all that. And then he kind of synthesizes that knowledge over time. Yeah, I guess that's how I think what was sort of behind Shunzi's idea here.
Yeah, exactly. And it's easy to think of cases where it seems like the better way to learn a particular skill, or maybe even a kind of body of cognitive knowledge, like, I don't know, maybe mathematics even is certainly language, that these things are better acquired simply by adopting a practice without understanding the basis for the practice, and through repetition, habituation, and immersion, maybe something like kind of gradual appreciation, come to see the basis for them. I think we all can think of cases like that. And I think one way of reading Xunzi, yes, is more or less to see him as saying all of ethical learning is like that. It's essentially like learning to master music or cooking or what have you. But he has these other analogies I think are subtly but importantly different, that compare adopting the Confucian way not to adopting an art or craft like music or cooking, but rather to adopting a well-established technology that you have good reason to believe works really well. And so that brings us to our other passage. Maybe we should read that one.
Okay, yeah. So this other passage has to do with analogy to pre-existing technologies. This is a bit shorter. Okay, so here's how the passage goes. Gong Shu could not improve on the plumb line, and none of the sages can improve on ritual. The common people take ritual as their model, but do not understand it. The sage takes ritual as his model and does understand it.
Yeah, so that's also the Ercutin translation. Gong Shu, this person mentioned at the very beginning, is famously, apparently a master craftsperson from ancient times.
Real quick, Justin, what's the plumb line? I think a lot of listeners probably have never heard of a plumb line. This is a pretty common object or a technique that you find throughout classical Chinese texts. And I must admit, when I first came across the plumb line, I've never heard of it myself. So maybe we should say something about that.
Yeah. Sheng, Shengmo is the usual pairing of Chinese characters you see in these classical texts. Yeah, so what is it? It's essentially a line with a weight on it. And so what is it supposed to do? Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you are concerned about the depth of a body of water, and constantly in ancient commerce and transportation, people were concerned about that. They needed to figure out whether they could ford a river or a lake, and how to cross and where it was shallow enough to cross. And they also needed to worry about whether their boat was going to beach, was going to become stranded in shallow waters. So they're always measuring the depth of water, and you just take a line and you put a weight on the end of it, and you dip it and see how far it dips, right? That's one thing you can do with a plumb line. Another thing you can do with a plumb line, I've noticed in classical texts, they often refer to the carpenter's use of the plumb line. And so I take it that's something like a concern with being, whether a particular wall, for example, or anything is vertical, right? You can rely on the plumb line to make sure that it's essentially straight up and down. And so, yeah, the analogy is meant to say, listen, if you want a straight up and down line, or if you want to figure out how deep, a river is or a lake or what have you, you can't improve on the plumb line. The plumb line is the best thing available for you to do that. And so rituals, the traditional rituals, stand in the same way to the individual kind of person trying to make up their own mind about how to behave in life, as the plumb line stands to someone who's trying to figure out how to build a nice vertical wall or measure the depth of a body of water. You can't improve upon it. It's the best of the available options. So this is just one passage among many where Xunzi compares the Confucian way to what I think of as pre-existing technologies. There are others. If you've read Xunzi at all, you've probably read the first chapter, known as the Chen Xue Pian, the chapter on encouraging learning. And lots of analogies to pre-existing technologies there, like the horse and chariot, carts, boats, and so on. So basically, just think, if you want to sort of get at this argument, which I think really pervades a great deal of the text, it's helpful just to think about the reasons why you would want to adopt a pre-existing technology that you know to work well, rather than try to reinvent that technology from the ground up according to principles that you can quickly grasp for yourself. So let's say you want to transport something heavy a great distance across land or across water, why would you think it would somehow be better for you to build a boat or a car or a cart or what have you on principles that you can grasp, rather than just taking it for granted that the best of the available technology available to you, whatever that is, whether it's a horse and cart or a car or a truck, electric vehicle or something, works, and then adopt it, and then sort of work backwards from the assumption that it works well. It seems like clearly when you present the metaphorical options that way, we're much better off adopting the pre-existing, well-established, well-confirmed technology than we are trying to go it alone and figure it out for ourselves. And so Xunzi is saying we're basically in the same position with respect to the Confucian way. The reason I like, of the two analogies, the reason I like the second one better, the one that compares learning the Confucian way to adopting pre-existing technology, is because, metaphorically speaking, it harmonizes so much better with the rest of the Xunzi. Xunzi loves to invoke pre-existing technologies. He also, I think, essentially understands the Confucian way as a kind of social technology. So if you want to understand in a more intuitive way why Xunzi finds moral deference so appealing, it's useful to know that he essentially understands the Confucian way as an invented thing, not a natural thing, something that sages and other wise people have invented, created. It won't seem natural to us. It seems very much like an artificial thing, right? And it's meant to solve social problems. It's meant to strike balances between competing values. It's meant to harmonize competing values. There are many areas of life where we have these kind of, values where if you want to instantiate one, you do so at the expense of the other. And it strikes the right balance or finds ways of dovetailing pursuit of those two values. It also is meant for Xunzi. He's quite interested in what I think of as collective action problems. Cases like, for example, with respect to environmental goods like clean air or clean water, where if everyone just acted on their own best interest, narrowly construed, it in fact would make everyone worse off. So that if everyone could just agree to some rules of engagement and sharing and so on, then in fact, everyone profits. If you agree not to use products that pollute the sources of water that you rely on and sources of air that you breathe, then everyone's better off. So lots of cases like that. He's struck by this idea that we essentially have collective action problems at the family level, at larger levels like the village level, larger community level, and then of course at the state level, world level. And the Confucian way is this vast social technology, almost like a machine, which has been over generations finely calibrated to solve all of these problems that pull us in all these different directions. And moreover, none of it is supposed to be natural. None of it's supposed to be naturally intuitive to us, right? Because after all, it's machinery, it's technology, it's artificial stuff that we created in order to bring about some particular effect or outcome. So when you put it that way, you can sort of see why Xunzi is sometimes frustrated with people like Mencius, who seem to think that somehow the Confucian way should seem natural to us, should even seem intuitive at some level, or at least in certain cases, to natural people without any education whatsoever. He thinks, why would that be? How improbable is that? The way itself is meant to solve all these extremely sophisticated social problems, and it's been finely calibrated, and none of the parts, therefore, should you assume, would seem natural to us. That would just be a lucky coincidence if it were, right? It's not answering to the demands of human nature. It's answering to all these social needs and requirements and these competing values. So in that case, why would you think that anyone would ever be able to get it for themselves and judge how best to use the machinery or how to build and make the machinery in the first place? He also is struck by this idea that all of the ethical values in the Confucian way, in some sense, depend on each other, right? So the way in which you perform a funeral when you're grieving someone who's deceased, he thinks that the sages finely tuned and calibrated those customs so as to strike the right balance between your kind of natural grief, outpouring of woe and grief and remorse, and this need to let go and gradually move on. So he talks about at first you mourn the deceased by keeping their body closer to your living spaces. But then as the body grows older and, looks a little fouler and smells fouler, you gradually move it out. You also pile more decorations, jewelry and nice clothing and that kind of thing on top. And so it's all meant to very carefully kind of gradually help you come to accept the death and move on while still giving proper tribute to the deceased. And then, of course, there are all these knock-on effects for proper grieving, like they help build a sense of civility, a sense of compassion for the loved ones of the deceased, and so on. And so you could go on all day, really, identifying what it is that makes the particular ritual protocols that Xunzi recommends to people for grieving the right ones. Similarly, let's now go back to the technology analogy. You can imagine someone looking at this vast, complex machinery and wondering, why does this piston rotate in this direction rather than the other direction? Why does it rotate clockwise rather than counterclockwise? And why does it rotate at this pace rather than this other pace? And the only answer is going to be, well, it's because that's how it works best in tandem with all the other parts of the machine, right? And none of these parts of the machine are natural. They're all artifice. So it's unlikely that you will ever be able to just sort of figure out for yourself, just looking at one part all by yourself, why that's the optimal way of building the part, right? And making it work. So the sort of optimal function of any one part is not going to be intuitive to you, because after all, what counts as the optimal function of any one part depends on the proper functioning of all the other parts. And that's something that no one person can fully grasp. So to kind of bring it all together, I say Xunzi has a strong pro-deference view. I call it the pervasive moral deference view. He basically thinks that in all domains of ethics, whether it's child rearing, whether it's marriages, whether it's guest host protocols, public policy, that kind of stuff, in all those areas of life, that you will never be able to fully grasp all the considerations or reasons why the traditional models, as implemented by the sort of authoritative interpreters of that tradition, are better than any particular way of implementing the models that you yourself could come up with on your own. There's no one person who can do that except the sage. The sage, sometimes he refers to this figure he calls the Daru, the person of great classical learning, who, like the sage, also seems to be capable of independently figuring out the optimal way of instantiating various moral values, various rituals. But other than those extremely rare individuals, the rest of us are dependent to greater and lesser degrees on the ritual tradition, what he calls traditional models, which are essentially models of ritual behavior and rules of right and wrong, and what he calls the Shi, the teacher, who is a kind of domain-specific expert who can explain in certain domains of ethics, like guest host protocols or child rearing, why you should practice a certain ritual one way rather than another. But in my reading, and I admit this is a little bit controversial, even the domain-specific experts, the teachers, the interpreters themselves, their understanding of what makes the traditional rituals right, while better than the novices, is not perfect. It doesn't go all the way down. They also have to take for granted that other parts of the Confucian way are good ones, even if they don't understand why. So they're a bit like someone who's explaining why this one piston should rotate clockwise at a certain pace and not at another pace. They can tell you why that part functions well in that particular circumstance, but they can't actually account for all the parts. And thus they are still deferring to the tradition in that more circumscribed sense.
Yeah, so in football, they have specialized coaches. Like a certain coach specializes in defense, and another might specialize in offense. Yeah, so one kind of coach might have greater knowledge in that domain, but not necessarily know exactly the rationale for, why the quarterback is supposed to act in a certain way on the offense. So yeah, Xunzi's view is extremely, I realize, more and more sophisticated. And so he views the entire ethical system of the Confucian way and all the ritual protocols and so on as part of this gigantic machinery that's so complicated that it's going to be very rare for anyone to really grasp each of the component parts and the functions that they serve and so on, except for, I guess, the sages. And although he does have this line, doesn't he say everyone can become a sage? I always did wonder about that because it seems like such a hard task,
Yeah.
In that way, it struck me that he's actually weirdly more optimistic than Mencius in a certain sense, because he doesn't think human nature is good, but yet You think
Yeah.
somehow everyone could become a sage. That's real optimism.
Yeah,
I
although
did,
it's
yeah.
extremely rare, right? So his understanding of history is not that unusual. A lot of Confucians have this understanding. Maybe if you were really lucky, there was a period where two or three came along in one lifetime. For the most
Yeah,
part, you can go hundreds of years without a sage.
right.
So when
Yeah.
I say he endorses pervasive moral deference, I'm saying that basically for most intents and purposes, all of us can assume that in all cases, no matter what domain we're in, we should defer to the tradition, at least to a great degree. Maybe some of us can
Hmm.
become domain-specific experts in one little area. That still
Hmm.
doesn't mean that we can entirely trust our own judgment, because after all, we've become the kind of person who can repair and replace one part of the machine, but you still can't fully account for what makes that part a good one or an optimal one because you don't understand all the other parts of the machine.
Yeah. And Xunzi does subscribe to a kind of moral self-cultivation model. So he does think that ritual practice is a kind of formative process by which we do refine our desires, sync our desires to our emotions and thoughts, and so on. So I guess I
Yeah.
would have thought, yeah, he does think that at least a process of being on the proper Confucian path also does kind of transform our beliefs and desires and emotions. And so we do become, hopefully, I guess, if you're on the right program, you become more virtuous. And then I
Yes.
suppose you do become somewhat more autonomous, or would you
Yeah.
put that as a slightly different kind of concept there?
Yeah, that's right. There's a danger of kind of getting into the weeds here, but I'm going to say just enough that hopefully we can avoid it. So as I read Xunzi, yes, he thinks that if you are on the path of the the kind of scholar, person of service who aspires to be someone who serves in government and plays a kind of leadership role, then yes, you do need to acquire greater moral understanding and thus a certain degree of autonomy. Now, what's really cool about Xunzi is that he provides us with frameworks that we can use to wrap our minds around what it means when we say greater or lesser degree of autonomy. In various places, he makes distinctions between people who have a certain degree of autonomy in certain domains, the ones that they're familiar with, ones that they have some practice in, some they've actually engaged in some practice and seen the results of their practice, and those who have a more kind of global autonomy, which essentially are the sages or the people of great classical learning. So there's kind of domain-specific and global kinds of autonomy, but more importantly, there's a kind of autonomy that's very important to Xunzi. Essentially, what you have is what he calls a proper model, a fa. And we can think of a proper model as something like a rough description of the rules of behavior you should abide by, or maybe a demonstration. Someone has shown you how you perform a ritual or shown you how to behave in various important public events. In those cases, you have this kind of rough idea of what you should do, but you don't yet have a very precise understanding of how you apply that rough description or demonstration to specific cases. You might have a rough idea that, at a funeral, you're supposed to show some grief, but not too much, and so on. That's far from having a very precise sense of like when you've been crying too much and you should try to rein it in. It's far from telling you like exactly what color your shoelaces should be when you wear your more formal clothing and so on. It's far from telling you what to do in borderline cases, like when should you even go to a funeral if it's like someone that you don't have any connection to, maybe you would be unwelcome there. So there are lots of things that need to be settled. And if you have some understanding of the formal model and you're a domain-specific expert, then essentially for Xunzi, you can be relied on to correctly apply the formal model. You can give the rough description and you can apply it correctly. So someone who's a domain-specific expert in funeral rituals will be able to mourn correctly, pretty reliably in most cases, right? So they have that kind of autonomy, but they don't have the kind of autonomy that would enable them to explain all of the reasons why the formal model itself is the correct one. Because after all, they still have to take it for granted that other parts of the machinery work the way they do without knowing why they should work that way, right? So they're like the person who knows that this piston has to work in tandem with these other spark plugs or whatever. They don't know why the spark plugs exactly are necessary. They might have some sense of it, but they don't have understanding of the sort of basis for all of the machinery that goes all the way down or is all comprehensive. So yeah, there's kind of different ways in which your autonomy can be more or less robust. One describes sort of the domain of the ethical life. How much of the ethical life can you rely on your own judgment? And then the other describes essentially how deep or how pervasive your understanding of the reasons for the models themselves is. As I read Xunzi, he's actually kind of making a distinction between grasping how to apply a model in a certain domain of life and understanding the sort of deep reasons for the model. Yeah, and so only the sage really understands the deep reasons for the model.
All right. Yeah, this is really fascinating. But I think at this point, we should turn to the later Confucians and some of the objections that were raised against Xunzi. Just a quick little history. So, starting with some Song Dynasty Confucians in the 11th century, really for the rest of Chinese imperial history, I think Chinese thinkers, we can safely say, for the most part, rejected Xunzi's view and defended at least some moderately pro-autonomy view. And some were even defending some form of radical pro-autonomy, as we'll talk about. So now, if I remember correctly, in your published piece, Justin, you build on the comparisons to machinery or social technology to explain where the later Confucian philosophers stand. And I think it'd be helpful for you to do that here.
Yeah, okay. I find this helpful. This is really me. Yeah, I'm building on the metaphor of machinery in order to explain how the later Confucians object to Xunzi. This is all me. It's me just trying to make it intelligible to people, right? It's not them. They don't use the machine analogy. But all right, so here it is. As I understand the later Confucians, they basically think this. They understand that Xunzi believes the Confucian way is like social technology, that it's like a machine. But they think that his way of assessing how functional or how good the machinery is wrong. It's too one-sided, right? So he's basically thinking of the technology in terms of social problems that can be solved by the machinery, right? So you have this problem of like striking a balance between fairness and prosperity or something. And so, you have these recommendations for how people should divide up property and other goods that strikes the right balance, And then you have all these collective action problems. That machinery is meant to be solving those problems. And insofar as it solves those problems, it's good machinery. That's basically his view. So by analogy, insofar as your widget making machine makes lots of good widgets that are tough and don't break easily and produces many of them, like large numbers of them relatively efficiently, that's a good machine. Now, what they're saying is actually that is a one-sided way of assessing machinery and its parts. What also makes for good machinery is how well it can be grasped by us, ordinary human beings, how intelligible it is to us. And that's important to them, I think, because they see the intelligibility of the machinery to us as an important part of becoming a wholeheartedly virtuous person. So they think that becoming fully virtuous requires that we don't just take it on the authority of some expert or some series of customs or conventions or traditions that they're the best practices. We should see and understand the reasons for ourselves, and that then better positions us to adopt these ethical values in a more wholehearted manner. What I mean by wholehearted, of course, is a little up for grabs. I can try to make it intuitive by giving some examples if you like. Anyway, that's the gist of it. So basically, you have to, as they say, get it oneself if you want to achieve a kind of wholeheartedness in virtue. So that's the general line of argument. There are other views, by the way. There are other arguments against Xunzi, but that's kind of the one that I think does the most work in the later tradition. So now, what exactly do we mean when we say that they're pro-autonomy? Well, in most cases, I think they have a relatively moderate position, according to which we just need to assume that there's some domains of life where even people without a great deal of formal training or education in ethics, without any kind of lot of ethical experience, can get it right, can arrive at good judgments on the basis of their own grasp of the reasons for those judgments. And those are the moderates. There are also some people, clearly, in the tradition that are radicals about what I'm calling epistemic autonomy in ethics, that think that basically in all things, you should ultimately rely on your own best judgment, your own grasp of the relevant reasons. So the radicals are kind of, in some sense, their position is easiest to characterize. If we want to distinguish between radicals and moderates, we can start with the radicals. The radicals are people like Wang Yangming, by the way, the sort of Ming Dynasty, Neo-Confucian, or people who are in his lineage in the late Ming. There are these people who kind of endorse an arguably an even more radical view than Wang Yangming. And they think, by analogy, that in some sense, all of the machinery of the Confucian way should be intuitive to us, should seem compelling to us. The kind of wholeheartedness that they think society needs requires that basically everyone be trying to get it themselves, be acting on their own consciences, their own understanding of what's virtuous or what's vicious, what's right or wrong. So that position is the radical position. But there's also the moderate position. And the moderate position is basically this. The moderates say it's not that all of the machinery should be intuitive to us. They're willing to make allowances for the fact that sometimes you need machinery that does really sophisticated stuff and thus will not be intelligible to us in the way that we might want. Sometimes we have to adopt moral norms that just won't seem obvious to us, that'll seem wrong by our own lights. However, it's still the case that the machinery has to have certain intuitive points of entry, certain parts whose good functioning we can understand just by our own lights, on our own terms, without necessarily having to presuppose that the whole tradition is right or warranted or correct, that all the machinery works correctly. And so, insofar as you have these points of entry, you can then build outward and see that other parts of the machinery is in some sense analogous to, or kind of in readily recognizable ways similar to, the parts that are intuitive. So that in principle, you can build outward from these points of entry and grasp how the other parts work as well. So those moderates are people like Zhu Xi, whom we've talked about before, Dai Zhen, one of my favorite historical Confucian philosophers. They all endorse this idea that at least in certain domains of the ethical life, sort of those that correspond with what Mencius called the four sprouts, right? Those that the four beginnings of virtue. Those are the ones that we should be able to get for ourselves rather intuitively, and then build out from those so that we eventually come to grasp more difficult, less intuitive, more complicated moral norms. Also by our own lights, also get them for ourselves.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to this view. It provides a kind of continuity in that we need these points of entry. I guess I would have thought via the sprouts to be able to kind of make morality home for us instead of just kind of alienating in some way.
Yeah.
So I'm very sympathetic to that view. And Xunzi, I think, has a hard time explaining that process because he thinks human nature is morally blind, as P.J. Ivanhoe puts it. I've given talks about the different theories of moral development at different places. And one kind of objection that I've heard from some people who are more sympathetic, actually, to Xunzi's view, although I must say I'm more sympathetic to the later Confucian view here. They say, but when you do think of cultivation of certain skills like piano, it could be very tedious for a lot of kids. In fact, I learned piano for about a year and I just couldn't stand playing anymore. And so I kind of dropped out. But there are a lot of people who, they're kind of forced to play for years and they don't even enjoy it. And they just practice their charity in hand into scales. And after many years, they become very good. And then later in their adult life, they can come to even appreciate it. Yeah, so I guess one thought is, well, even without the entry point, people somehow do, at least in some of those skills, they can come to deeply enjoy and even love the practice way later after many years of difficulty and feelings of alienation and struggle. Yeah, I wonder, what do you think about that kind of objection?
Yeah, that seems like a good way of pushing back, right? So one of the ways in which the Xunzians can respond to these later critics of Xunzi is they can say, look, there are many areas of life where we come to appreciate a craft or an art or maybe a series of techniques where we start out with techniques whose underlying principles are much more complicated than anything we could grasp in a reasonable time period, Like, oftentimes people start learning to play piano at 5. Not reasonable to expect a 5-year-old to grasp the reasons why they should do their scales or play these really cheesy, simple songs and so on. But eventually, you can get to the point where you really have internalized the practice and the technique, and it feels natural to you. Maybe everything that I described as wholehearted before, which I thought required getting it oneself, maybe you can achieve a kind of wholeheartedness without getting it oneself, maybe just through sheer repetition. So it becomes sort of like second nature to you. That's a kind of getting it oneself. Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts, and too many actually to address, but there are many ways in which the later Confucians, critics of Xunzi, could respond to that line. But I think perhaps their go-to source of inspiration will be the old farmer song pulling up the sprouts metaphor. So essentially, Mencius 2a2. Mencius 282 is a very famous passage in the Mencius, the Mengzi, that many later Confucians found influential. Mencius offers this metaphor for someone who's trying to rush the process of cultivating his virtues or her virtues. And that metaphor is a farmer in the state of Song who wants his grains to grow more quickly. He's getting impatient with the fact that his grains are growing. And so he goes out and pulls on them to sort of rush the process of their growth, which of course uproots them, pulls them out of the ground so that they are soon lying on the ground withering. So he's essentially killed them in the process of trying to rush them. Mengzi says moral cultivation can't be rushed in the same way, just as you can't rush the process of the growth of these grains, right? Specifically, what he says is, if you engage in some righteous act and you don't derive some gratification from it, then that will starve the sprout of righteousness. That'll starve the kind of the plant that is feeding the virtue of righteousness. You're not providing it with the nourishment that it needs in order to grow, essentially. He thinks that some kind of delight, gratification, joy in engaging in your virtuous actions is necessary in order to help the virtue grow. And so I think that the defenders of getting it oneself, of a moderate or in some cases more radical epistemic autonomy in ethics, are going to want to push a similar line against defenders of Xunzi. They're going to say, that's nice in principle. I mean, maybe it works for playing the piano, but when it comes to the virtues that really matter, the ones that you depend on, that you want to be really robust, the ones that kind of help you to do the right thing, even in the face of great temptations, to be more corrupt or behave in a more kind of ruthlessly selfish way. In those cases, you just aren't going to have strong virtues unless you're kind of regularly feeding them with some sense of joy and gratification in your ethically good behavior. And you're not going to have that joy and gratification unless you understand why your ritually proper behavior is in fact virtuous or good.
And that joy and gratification can't be through external rewards, right? Like
yes,
you like sharing, right, or you like helping people because other people like you develop a better reputation, you have more social standing. And those are, we would consider instrumental or external goods. So they think that, no, that is not going to help you to actually develop the virtues. You got to have the intrinsic joy that's proper to the virtuous activities.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah, right. So if in fact you see the virtuous behavior as rewarding simply because of the goods it brings you, like acclaim in your community, people love you more because you seem to be a righteous person, that kind of thing, then that's not the right way of cultivating the virtue. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why they do think that you need to have those sort of natural, maybe even innate entry points, something like those sprouts, because you're already sort of equipped to have those, let's say, the feelings of compassion, the desire to respect the elderly and so on. Because now acting in accordance with those kinds of natural inclinations will give you some specific moral satisfaction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I should say when I'm developing this line of argument against Xunzi, I'm filling in a lot of the gaps. So actually what happened historically speaking is by the time these Neo-Confucians came along and started talking about zide, about getting oneself, Xunzi was so out of favor that many people didn't feel like they needed to explain exactly what was wrong with Xunzi's view. But one influential view that comes from one of the Chung brothers, I think it's Chung Yi, but I'm not sure, is that essentially because Xunzi thought human nature was bad, he got the great foundation of virtue wrong. He missed the great foundation of virtue. So the way he puts it in this very influential text known as the Reflections on the Things at Hand, it's kind of like a textbook for Neo-Confucian studies, because he says, as soon as Xunzi utters this one proposition, human nature is bad, the great foundation of virtue has already been lost. And so I think that the later Confucians sort of spelled that claim out in a number of different ways. But one thing they all had in common is that they basically took him to be saying that insofar as Xunzi thought that all of the Confucian way is in some sense an artificial thing and unnatural and not intuitive, and thus it's not possible that there be sprouts of virtue, beginnings of virtue like the kind that Mencius proposed. He was basically ruling out the possibility of becoming virtuous in the first place. They just couldn't see of any plausible way that someone could become virtuous if one didn't have those, what I'm calling points of entry, that kind of cognitive and emotional foundation by which you come to grasp all the machinery. So,
Yeah. And what's interesting is maybe the most famous student of Xunzi, Han Feizi, ultimately kind of agrees with these later Confucians in a way, right? Because Han
mm,
Feizi thought, that's right, human nature is bad, just like my teacher Xunzi thought. And that's exactly why aiming for moral self cultivation is just a bad aim because it's
yeah,
not going
right.
to happen. And so the later Confucians, at least in that regard, are agreeing with Han Feizi. And Han Feizi is maybe rightly
Yeah,
noticing that that's why you go for extrinsic rewards and punishments, or you
yeah,
make sure that people act rightly not because of some internal moral joy, because human nature is bad and that'll never be cultivated, but you have the harsh punishments and rules and regulations.
yeah. That's great, Richard. That's a nice reframing of the history. Yeah, one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that Han Feizi, the great legalist philosopher who was, in some sense, the philosophical spokesperson for what became the ruthless Qing dynasty, right? That he himself, I mean, according to most accounts, was a student of Xunzi's. But most people think, well, he was in some sense both continuous with and discontinuous with Xunzi, right? He both continued Xunzi's views in some sense, but also parted from Confucianism entirely. Yeah, that's one way of telling the story. Is you could say he was like Xunzi, but also saw how implausible, given Xunzi's account of moral norms, moral virtues, what he calls proper patterns of righteousness and ritual propriety, given how difficult it would be to actually master those and fully internalize those particular moral norms. He just thought you should give up on the whole enterprise. I like that idea. Can I just say something more about this? I've written these papers on getting at oneself that get really technical and on moral expertise in Xunzi. But I want, for purposes of today's discussion, to keep it at a pretty broad level where we're talking about the big picture issues. And one big picture issue that comes up when I present on this material to both students and to philosophers who don't know Chinese tradition that well is basically this. I keep finding again and again that there are some people for whom, when I present the options, they're just instinctively with Xunzi. They just can't see their way past Xunzi. And one way they express that view when I present the criticism of Xunzi is as follows. They say, okay, great. Let's imagine that you have machinery that's really complicated, that's performing a really complicated task. And it just so happens that some parts of the machinery are intuitive, that you can just kind of, a person without a lot of training can look at them and figure out what they're trying to do, why it is that they're successful, and just assess that part of the machinery is functioning well without knowing the rest of the machinery. Wonderful. Good for you. But how likely is that really? That seems extremely improbable, It just seems like it would be an incredibly fortunate accident. Because on the one hand, there's human nature and there's heart and mind as they are by nature, which is determined by one set of conditions, essentially. I mean, we would now say evolution or what have you, right? Just all these kind of circumstances that have to do with our natural selection and how the world works. That's one thing. And then on the other hand, there's all these other considerations, like what makes for good machinery, which seem like they have nothing to do with natural selection or how we are by nature. And so people sort of present that view to me, that kind of conceptual framework to me. And having adopted that framework, it just seems extremely improbable that there ever would be intuitive points of entry into the machinery. You see the worry there?
Just to clarify, so because
Yeah.
one thought I quickly had was Xunzi, he's a pretty brilliant thinker. I mean, what if he had this thought that, well, with the rituals and the Confucian protocols and the ethical framework as a whole, it factors all that in a way. Like it pays
Mm-hmm.
attention to human psychology, kind of the natural innate tendencies and desires of human beings, even if it is very selfish generally. It
Mm-hmm.
factors all of that in and then has it so that there's, okay, maybe not points of entry, but at least there's a way for the whole mechanism to work at a certain level where some people do find some attraction to some part or domain. So I
Yeah.
wonder if Shunzi could respond like that and say,
Yeah.
yeah, that's all factored in there.
Yeah, that's right. I think when I think about how to continue this debate, I also am tempted by that view, which is to say that even if Xunzi didn't talk about it very much, even if he didn't pay much lip service to this idea that you need to modify the machinery to account for how the machinery operators can understand it, to take account of that, of those kind of limitations. Still, it seems like that's a point he could take on board without having to dramatically revise or modify his framework. Yeah. So it could be that one could be a kind of Xunzian in terms of their core commitments, while still allowing for the fact that some parts of the machinery have to be more intelligible to us than others.
Yeah, because he might say, of course, right? If certain people need to be tortured all the time, yeah, no one's gonna resonate with that. But certain kinds of rituals, they're at least somewhat neutral and they can mesh with psychology or human psychology and human motivation. And so
Yeah.
that's all kind of designed so that, yeah, only those have been chosen and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. That's possible. I think that's a good way to go if you're a Xunzian. So I have to say, I still think that there are some resources available to the later critics of Xunzi, especially to Dai Zhen, this 18th century Confucian, who is in some sense the most subtle and the most astute about Xunzi. I mean, his account of the history of Confucianism on Zide, if he were to sort of have spelled it out completely, would come very close to mine. I think that he himself would still have things he could say in response. But before we get to those responses, let me just say this much. I think that actually, oftentimes in philosophy, when you have a kind of big conceptual framework or a theory, and you've divided up the options, you get to this point where you can, in some sense, problematize any theory such that it begins to blur a little bit with the other theories. So sorry for this shop talk, everyone who doesn't work in modern ethics, but there's this debate about whether consequentialism and virtue ethics really are distinctive from one another. What if you just say that the good that should be maximized, in the consequentialist sense is virtue, right? Don't you end up looking a lot like a virtue ethicist? Some people argue that you can blur the boundaries between the two theories by doing that. And so my view is that generally in philosophy, oftentimes, if it takes a lot of work to really spell out truly logically mutually exclusive options. And so sometimes you can problematize the boundaries essentially between the two options. And I think that's what you're doing here, Richard, but I still find it useful to have what I think of as prototypes or models of the two views, so you at least can understand what's intuitive about the two views before you do that. So, if at the end of the day it turns out you can bring all of the Neo-Confucian objections on board and somehow integrate them into a fundamentally Xunzian picture, that's okay with me. I still think it's useful to have in mind these two options. One is that you assess the machinery solely in terms of how well it produces widgets or how well it solves social problems. That's the pure Xunzian view, maybe a kind of caricature Xunzi. And on the other hand, you assess the machinery in part on how well it produces widgets, but also in part on how intelligible it is and how compelling it is to people who actually use it, the machinery operators. So, yeah, I just want to say, I think there's still some advantage in sort of spelling out the positions, even if we can kind of collapse the distinction between them. But as for the later critics of Xunzi, yeah, I think that they're just going to insist that Xunzi is not sufficiently mindful of all the work that we have to do in choosing our moral norms to make sure that we can truly grasp them in a wholehearted way. So the later tradition does a lot of theorizing about a certain feature of full virtue that the Chinese term is cheng. We can translate it as something like sincerity, integrity. One thing that's clear about cheng is that it's a feature of full virtue and that it entails wholeheartedness. So if you are sincerely filial, then you are wholeheartedly filial. If you're sincerely righteous, then you're wholeheartedly righteous. And that means that you don't just endorse the correct ethical behavior and enact it. It means that you're sort of psychologically speaking all on board with it. Like your desires, your feelings, your emotions, even how things seem to you intuitively are on board with the morally virtuous behavior. So you're not just visiting a sick parent in the hospital out of duty, but because you imagine what it's like to be them and to be this sort of vulnerable person in this big impersonal institution, and you realize, they feel so helpless and alone, and you'd want them to help them. And you'd also reflect on all the nice things that your parents have done for you and how grateful you are for their tremendous sacrifices, so that it seems like the least you can do, Now you're fully on board, and there's no part of you that's sort of reluctantly visiting the sick parent in the hospital. That sort of achievement, they just think in a number of different ways, Xunzi can't account for how we ever get there, If it turns out that the machinery is so alien and is so preoccupied with solving the problems that the social technology is meant to solve, then they just don't see how we could ever have any reasonable hope of wholeheartedly adopting the Confucian values.
Yeah. No, I think ultimately there is some deep disagreement here for sure, even if we, make those kinds of philosophical moves to continue to qualify, Xunzi's view. I think it seems like Xunzi definitely holds a kind of primacy of the effectiveness of the rituals or like, the parts and the way that it serves the whole.
Yeah.
And the Neo-Confucians, I don't think they hold to that kind of primacy. They seem very keen on the way that the person can commit fully with sincerity and wholeheartedness. So I think that will be still a fundamental disagreement. And of course, there's that disagreement about human nature. That's still going to be there. There's no way to really get around that, I think. Yeah, but you're totally right. Contemporary philosophers, like sometimes they try to merge consequentialism and virtue ethics, which I don't think works because virtue ethicists tend to reject the maximization thesis. But I guess that's a conversation for another day. Yeah, I think at this point, we've went on for well over an hour. So I think we might need to kind of wrap up. But I wonder, Justin, you've been thinking so long about this. You wrote this very nice essay, which I really enjoyed reading. Is there like another next step in this kind of project of yours, like that you're kind of thinking through?
So the reason I wrote that piece that's meant for the general public is because essentially what I was doing was I was writing these really narrow, much more academic articles on specific parts of the big picture. And I was presenting them to people. So I was presenting these papers on what sort of work inference is doing in getting at oneself. And I think people, of course, some people get into that, but other people were sort of like, well, what's the payoff here? Why should I care about this issue? So yeah, as I see it, actually, this is a vast, sprawling, complicated issue with many interesting facets. And all we've tried to do today is give you a big picture sense of the options. So the options are essentially pervasive moral deference, which is the Xunzi view, and then moderate autonomy, which is the Jushi and Daijun view, and then more radical autonomy, which is the Wang Yangming view. And you can begin to see various ways in which you can push on some of the more contentious claims that any of these factions is presupposing. And then as for like how far you can push, that will depend on the details. So it depends a lot, for example, on what you mean by getting it for oneself, It depends a lot on what you mean when you say that the machinery is alien or unnatural. So I think, there's a lot more to be said about all of these issues, but it helps to have a kind of big picture framework on which to hang the various possible positions. So some of the questions we could end with, and without answering, are these, I think. To what extent is this analogy to social technology an apt one? Is it useful to think of the Confucian way as like technology? Is it useful? Is it apt to say that the reasons we should adopt the Confucian way are analogous, are relevantly similar to the reasons why, if you want to transport something heavy a long distance, you should adopt the best of the available technology to do that? Or do we think that ethics is somehow fundamentally different? It's not like a technology. Somehow we shouldn't have that kind of relationship to it that we have towards our technology, which has maybe implications for the reasons to adopt the technology in the first place, That's, for me, a really interesting way to go with it. In some sense, we've only just touched upon the controversy, but it's useful to bear the analogy in mind as we think about it.
Yeah, no, that's a deep, difficult issue that I think gets manifested across the history of ethics in different forms. I think Philippa Foot sort of went back and forth on this issue, for example, about whether the virtues are beneficial and in what sense are they. And she had a bit more of kind of, almost a kind of a utilitarian understanding of virtues at one point, which I think she came to reject. And I've wondered about this too. I mean, when you take a moral imperative like do not kill an innocent person, it seems to me like it's improper to understand the wrongness of killing an innocent person by appealing to the way that it'll derail the common good or anything of that nature. The wrongness, the deep wrongness of just killing someone, an innocent person, has to do with the harm you bring to that person, the wronging. That, I think, to appeal to something else like in the Xunzian kind of sense, serving the greater whole or something like that, just seems like the wrong kind of explanation, at least for something like that kind of imperative.
Yeah, that's a nice example, Richard. So there are a couple of things that are interesting about it. First of all, as you suggest, following Philip afoot, maybe it's the case that, killing someone, especially an innocent person, is wrong just because killing someone is an innocent person is wrong, independently of how it fits into an overall optimal social system or system that harmonizes people socially or what have you. So yeah, it might be that if you're too holistic, as Xunzi tends to be, then you're kind of in some way describing the reasons that make it wrong in the wrong way. You're actually kind of latching onto the wrong features of the moral system. That's one thing to bear in mind. Another thing I like about it is this. So as I read my moderate pro-autonomy people like Jushi and Daijun, they basically think that we have to have points of entry. And since we must have them, they might as well be the ones that we essentially can't help but endorse and really adhere to. So Jushi has this expression which means something like the norms for how things ought to be that you can't even help, you can't even resist in some sense, you can't stop. So in Chinese, it's 说当然是则而不容易, the norms that for how things ought to be that you can't stop. And he has in mind things like the norm that makes you really want to save that child. If you're in a position, you see a child crawling to the very edge of a well, there's a part of you that wants to reach out and stop the child from falling in the well. He thinks you essentially can't help but have that moral view. And those might as well be, on his view, the points of entry. We already understand them pretty intuitively. We actually understand them in a sophisticated way. If you really probe why someone would rush to stop a child from falling into the well, you'll find that they actually are doing a lot of sophisticated implicit cognition and figuring that out. They're not just trying to people please or be a hero or something. And so I think it's a little bit strong to say that we can't help but have these views. Surely, I guess we could sort of raise ourselves in this strange, weird environment where we somehow don't come to endorse the norm that you should save a child from falling into a well. But I think their point is that you could only do it at great cost. We'd have to so warp the human heart so as to endorse these counterintuitive moral norms that we'd no longer be recognizably human, and it would probably be pretty bad for our mental health, for our psyches. So they're saying essentially, by any reasonable understanding of the costs and benefits, we basically have certain moral norms that we can't help but strongly endorse. And those might as well be the points of entry into the machinery. So we should build the machinery around those points of entry. That's the way I read these later thinkers.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible. These are basic ethical principles that almost seem impossible to just let go of. Not logically impossible in the sense of the philosophers, but
right.
What would it take for you to really think that, let's say, just killing innocent children is okay? It's hard for me that belief that it's wrong seems as strong as almost any belief that I have.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very plausible view.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny, as I get older, I come closer and closer to this moderate position. I see myself as a historian first, Richard. So my first loyalty is to the philosophers themselves. I want to be able to explain their views by their own lights in, roughly in terms that they would have found friendly to their enterprise. But it's hard not to think about which view is correct. And if you force me to choose, I think I'll probably side with the moderate pro-autonomy group, at least right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much, Richard, for indulging me. It was Richard who kindly suggested, after I published this piece, that we organize a whole episode around it. We'll link to the piece. We'll link to some other useful pieces too. There's a lot of good literature on moral deference, moral autonomy, even in the context of Western philosophy. But there's also some stuff on expertise and getting at oneself in the Chinese tradition. And I think I would like to say that someday we'll follow up on these issues. There's a lot more to say about getting at oneself, for example, that I'd love to indulge in. But that's, I guess, another project for another time. So we'll say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.